something of a revival of London writing. I mean, commonly today people think of the 80s and the 90s, particularly Peter Ackroyd's books, Moorcock's Mother London, Martin Amis' London Field, as marking a point where London literature was revived and there was this new interest in writing about London. But it seems to me that that revival actually took place in the early 70s, but actually was completely overlooked. If you think of 1975 is a sort of golden year for London writing. J.G. Ballard's High Rise in 1975, Maureen Duffy's Capital, and of course Ian Sinclair's Blood Heat, which was, all three were to various degrees completely ignored and overlooked. And it wasn't until 10 years later that people look back on them. J.G. Ballard's work was all out of print until quite recently. Ian Sinclair's work comes from the 70s and he came back recently and so on. Maureen Duffy wrote this first in 1974, and then in 2001 it was reissued along with Gerald Kirsch's Fowlers and Alexander Barron's The Low Life and Henry Green's Court by Harbour, was their London writing series. It had been out of print for several years after its initial publication. It's now out of print once again. Maureen Duffy's still writing, and it's difficult to see whether she's so much a lost London writing or rather writing is just sort of perennially unfashionable. A lot of the books we mentioned here seem to have a small core audience of people who incessantly talk about them, encourage their republication, and impress them upon their friends. I don't think that's the case with Maureen Duffy. I noticed when I was reading out the list earlier, I think there's only one person who read this. But it's an absolutely fantastic novel, and also, just like Arthur Machen, anticipates a lot of the themes that have become recognisable in London fiction in the last 20 years. Prior to this, in 1969, she wrote Wounds, and then I think in 1983, Londoners, and the three together form a very loose trilogy, what she calls a triptych of three images of London life. I think this is by far and away the most interesting of the three, and it's got a strange structure. It has a prologue and an epilogue that have this Ballardian image of future desolation of London destroyed, and the whole book it has a sense of London being a city under threat. The main character, Meepers, is this amateur historian who's obsessed with the idea of London in the Dark Ages and trying to prove that London has been continuously inhabited for the last 2,000 years, hoping that this proof that London can survive the Dark Ages means that it will be able to survive some future Dark Age to come. In that sense, most obviously, it anticipates Thatcherism in the 80s, which so many of the London writers in the 80s have written against. It also interweaves a narrative about London in 1975 with periods of London's previous history, in a way that suggests that London's past is tangible in the present. It isn't something dead or forgotten. It's something that's alive in the everyday. Once again, that's something that's been repeatedly recalled in recent London fiction. And finally, it also has this sense of the main character having this almost telepathic ability to tap into the lives of London's dead, of London's past, as a sort of a cult flavour that wasn't really present in London fiction in the 70s, but was to become ubiquitous in the 80s and 90s. I'm going to read the opening passage. He couldn't help it if the bones poked through the pavements under his feet. Plague victims, there was a pit hereabouts, he was sure, jumbled together, massacred Danes weighted by their axes to the riverbed, the cinders of legionaries in periphery, and glass urns gritting beneath the soles of his thin shoes. It was the living who passed ghostly around him. Through whose curiously incorporeal flesh he moved without sensation, while the dead pressed and clamoured, their cries drowning out the traffic. As he passed below, long-buried noblemen looked down at him from the portrait gallery, street names, enshrining their riverside mansions and estates above his head. Well, he had kept his, while most of them had lost theirs, one way or the other. He looked up at them without envy. He would have raised a glass if he had one, but it was too early in the day for that. The streets still chilled and the burnt diesel of the double-decker sharp in his nostrils. They had found mammoth bones here, he remembered, when they were digging, first underground in the 18...